Welcome back to the Father and Son podcast. I'm Nick Sobraco with my father, Leonard Sobraco. And today we are with who?
Today, our guest,
Filipe.
we are so pleased to have Filipe Vasconcelos, who's a longtime friend of ours, and he's a very successful businessman living in Sao Paulo, Brazil. He's worked as an executive for a number of large North American multinational companies, as well as Brazilian, and has traveled extensively throughout Brazil and the world. And today we're going to talk about one of our favorite countries in the world, Brazil. And we're going to talk about its history, politics, its place in the world, and so much more. We'd like to start with Filipe. Just give us a little background on yourself before we start
Yeah,
our discussion.
yeah. Well, first of all, it's really a pleasure to join you in this podcast, right? And just because we know each other for such a long time, and we really, been together so many places. I would just add that I am born in Italy, lived in many countries before I came to Brazil. Finally, at almost 16 to 17 years old. But since then, well, because my mother is Brazilian, my father Portuguese, both are not here with us anymore. But so I came to Brazil in 1981, basically now for 40 something years. And I studied economics, and I started my career very early in huge multinational, not only Americans, as you mentioned, Leonard, but others. And basically, I'm finishing my executive roles now since December. So I'm planning to take some more time and probably participating in some boards for special companies and just trying to be available to help people whenever I can.
Cool. Well, let's get into it. I was talking to my uncle, so his brother, and we were talking, and he made me think about something about Brazil, which was what is the average, like American, North American think of Brazil? And I was thinking about it. It was like, the soccer or football, the beaches, the Amazon, the Christ of the Redeemer, maybe Carnival, kind of a lot of basic stuff. So a lot of generalized stuff. What do you think? What do Brazilians think of Brazil? What is a kind of deeper level description of Brazil that the casual, random American or even European or whoever thinks about Brazil?
I think to answer your question, I would stay like many, many hours talking about it. But I would say this is such an amazing, big country and so diverse in terms of the cultures and the population backgrounds, which makes us kind of a unique place because if you travel through the country, you'll see the Northeast with a specific kind of history background and profiles. If you go to the South, it's kind of much different than that. Sorry, I have to turn this off. Uh, was this a problem? I can
You're
continue.
good. Keep going.
Yeah,
We're good.
and we have a huge industrial base and a huge agro base, and absolutely with services also. So we have kind of a very diverse economy. And of course, we love soccer, we love carnival, we love the beach, we love this country as we have it. But basically, I think that this country has a background of a very stable, uh, friendly country with all the world, all the neighbors. And I think that's just the way the Brazilians like to project themselves as being part of a broader world and not having problems with anybody. Although recent times more divisions are happening all over the country, but if you look at our past history, we've been always trying to help and be a very pacific nation. But at the same time, we are one of the nations in the world which has the highest difference in the gaps of the ones that have a lot and the ones that have nothing. So this is something that we don't feel proud about, but it's basically the huge challenge that we always have to think and face, continue facing for the future. A lot of things to do, We have been evolving over the last some couple of years, but still a long route to carry on.
Yeah, I think I forgot another thing that Americans probably think is like favelas. I'm sure favelas come to mind as well because you mentioned
Yep, yep.
the economic
It's
differences.
Yeah, this is something that we're not proud about because you would see the very, very super rich people, and at the same time as you've been here, you would walk in through many cities with very large poverty pockets, right? And at the same time, I mean, we don't need to be like that. So this is a challenge that we have to always try to do the best with the politics we have here. And evolving, as I said, you can look at many different terms, indices of people that have been and left above the poverty levels, and more people that have been to high school, and the population healthy level. All these indices, we have been much better, but still have a long way to go through.
Yeah, and I think if we go back to the history of Brazil, I think that's something that's pretty interesting because similar to the U.S., it's a product of colonization from Europe. I think Brazil is a little more interesting though because I'm pretty sure Portugal's only settled in Brazil. It didn't go to like any islands or anything. It might have, but I think mainly for the most part it was in Brazil. So I think it's a little interesting because unlike a lot of the other kind of Western
Hmm.
Americas, it was not Spanish, not English, not French.
Hmm.
So kind of like, what's the whether it's a brief explanation or however you want to get into it, but um, the brief story of how Portugal came to Brazil and that sort of
Hmm.
history of Brazil and Portugal and colonization.
So Portugal, such a small country with only 2 million people at the time, in the 15th century, basically, was really the first country in Europe to start the moving around the world and by in very small boats. So before the Portuguese actually arrived in Brazil, that was the year 1500, exactly April 1500. They had already been through all of Africa. So basically, they settled in all the West African coast and even in the Eastern African coast. So you have Mozambique as an example, Angola, Guinea-Bissau is in the West coast. And in Brazil, we actually have to believe, although there's a lot of theories concerning this, that it was kind of an accident with the boats that had actually planned to go to India, and they kind of moved around and hit Brazil. But a long story short, I would say that different than the US and some other colonies, but I would say very similar to the whole of South America, if you think about the Spanish and the Portuguese, which is only Brazil. Uh, we basically started the colonization for exploitation of commodities, right? And the way Portuguese settled in Brazil, they kind of divided the country, which at the time was basically the coast, right, into several what they would call capitanias, hereditary captains. So imagine that you were a very good friend of the king's. You were an important person in Portugal. You would inherit this huge piece of land, and you would be able to grow your crops and basically exploit and tragically then use the slaves and the Indian slaves, the native Brazilian, first of all, and then the African slaves. That this was the worst chapter in our history. Just to give you a number, and these are books I would suggest you recommend you reading. This is from a Brazilian historian. He wrote 3 books specifically about slavery. I'll give you his name. It's Laurentino. Laurentino. I'll give you his name. But just to give you a number, the estimate is that around 12 million Africans were transported to South and North America, and 40% of those came to Brazil. So this was basically in 300 years. But so we did progress in a very slow motion, and until, let's say, actually the beginning of the 20th century. Until then, we barely had any industries in the country. So we were basically through the commodity and the gold mining cycles. And so, and still, that was probably one of the reasons that you had so many people keeping all the money, and basically all the slaves coming into work. And then at the end of the 19th century, when we started to receive much more bigger numbers of Europeans, especially from Italy, from very diverse, from Germany also. So they went to the south. Then we started to receive, and this is interesting, we have the largest Japanese descendant colonies, Japanese people in Brazil, like I'd say 1.5 million to 2 million people in Brazil. That's almost 1% of the country's population, which are Japanese descendants. And they also came at the beginning of the 20th century.
I also think I've seen there's a ton of Brazilians in Japan. I'm pretty sure too.
Yeah, because like almost 30 years ago, Japan started to allow the Japanese descendants to come back and to work. They needed extra people to work at the time, so there were basically like 300 to 400,000 Japanese Brazilians that went back to Japan.
Hey, Filipe, I have a question. So, when in American history, it's a little bit the evolution of the country. Kind of a common thread is warfare, and the country started through a war. The American Revolution. In the 1770s and into 1783. Brazil's independence in 1822 was bloodless. And
completely different.
Brazil, yeah. And so touch on how did Brazil gain its independence? And Brazil doesn't have a history of warfare. I mean, the U.S.
very
right.
One small chapter. Yeah.
So first touch on how did Brazil become independent from Portugal in 1822? What happened?
Yeah. So that was another thing very unique to our country, because we actually had the Portuguese royal family moving to Brazil when the Napoleon War was hitting ground in the Iberic Peninsula, right? So this was in 1808. So they moved in, and then they said that Brazil was an empire, part of Portugal. So we had like the two kingdoms, the Brazilian kingdom and the Portuguese kingdom. And they remained, we remained as although a colony, but a kind of a promoted colony.
Like Algeria to France for a little bit. It was Algeria was part of France, so like kind of like that. Like it was part of. Was Brazil like part of Portugal, like as the country technically?
Yeah, I mean, different than what you were mentioning about Algeria, because here until the Napoleonic Wars, we were just a colony, right?
Yeah.
So Portugal had the royal family sitting there, and Brazil belonged to the royal family, as the other colonies in Africa too. But what happened is that when the royal family had to leave Portugal, because
the war was over, time to go home, right? Back to Lisbon.
So, but because they came to Brazil, they said now the main seat of the royals is not Portugal anymore. We're still Portuguese, but we're sitting in our other country, which is Brazil. And at that time, that was basically in 10 years or so. Of course, because of the war also, but it was the starting point that Brazil started to develop Banco do Brasil, for instance, the Bank of Brazil, started to develop more trade, especially with England, because so far it had to be done through Portugal. But then now Brazil could have some trade agreements of its own. So because the royal family was sitting here. So actually, we became independent, but we continued with the son of the king that had moved. So we actually were had our own royals until 1889
Yeah,
when we became a
the
republic.
son didn't want to return.
Yeah, because didn't
He-
well the dad put the son in charge, and then the son like, oh, our independence, and then
Our independence. This was Pedro the First for Brazil, but he actually went back to Portugal. He had to fight a war with his brother, so kind of a civil war. So he went back, but he left his elder son, which was still a very small kid, who became Pedro the Second. And Pedro the Second was actually the king of Brazil. They would say they were emperors because Brazil always thinks we're a big country, so we were an empire. And Pedro II was the emperor until 1889. So he was basically for 50 years. Brazil was, and a very interesting person, although he didn't do anything about slavery. By the contrary, Brazil was the last country to abolish slavery, which is another shame on our side.
Although
Last country,
not through war, though. It wasn't a civil war.
No, not through wars, not through
No.
war. And last country, not considering some of the African countries and Arab countries, but in what we would call the Western Hemisphere, right? But at the same time, it was actually this emperor who was a very interesting person because he was a historian. He would read a lot. He loved music, so he traveled through the world. And he was the one that started to open museums here and the first universities. So he had this kind of trend with being connected to the world. A cousin of the prince of the kings of England and the kings of Germany. So they were all cousins and friends. But to your point, we had a very slow process to get rid of slavery. We were obliged by the English at the beginning of the 19th century. And there's an interesting expression. You'll like to hear about that. We always say here that we want to pretend something. We say we're doing it for the English to see. So for a couple of decades, Brazil had abolished the slavery commerce, but still continued with some slavery, a lot of slavery, by the way. And then they started slowly saying that now the newborns in Brazil won't be slaves anymore. But because the whole coffees and sugar plantations and the exploitation of all the other commodities, they depended on so much of the slave hands, right, working. And the government didn't want to fight with the wealthy, rich families because otherwise they would say, hey, get out of here. We don't need you anymore. So it was kind of a compromise that they were able to keep this for 50 years, still running as a monarchy. And only in 1888 was that slavery was officially abolished.
Here's Brazil starting off really in a difficult position. I mean, they have a slavery-based economy, and it's a colonial puppet of sorts, right? So how do you overcome that? I mean, what impact has had that on today's Brazil? I mean, where do you see it? How's it overcome this? I mean, those are two major hurdles to overcome, and so many countries never overcome them or haven't to this day. So
Yeah.
tell us what Brazil was able to do to work through it.
Yeah. So I would say that we're still working through it because if you look at the discrepancy of the rich and the poor, you will see that the most of the poor people here are basically African descendants, not only, but in a bigger proportion. Although we used to say, and we like to say, that especially when we received all the immigrants coming from Italy, coming from Germany, from all of those places, At the same time, we were officially abolished slavery, and we started to settle the different kinds of people in the different kind of places. Somehow, the first 50, 60, 70 years in the late 20th century, we became a much more blended society because we would be marrying and having kids with different origins, right? So this is something also peculiar to our kind of society. We have a much more broader mixed kind of racial mixed society. And we started to like integrate with music, samba, right? Religion, if you think about all the specific qualities and specificalities of our religion base.
So it's a wonderful strength. In the U.S., we look at diversity. We have our own challenges, right?
But I think Brazil and
truly
the
a
U.S.
strength.
are similar. Brazil and U.S. are similar in that diversity aspect. I'd say Argentina's probably a little diverse as well because a lot of Europeans started to come down.
Yeah, but they didn't have the slave trade, and
they didn't have the slave trade,
and their native population was decimated.
Yeah.
So it's really mainly Brazil and the U.S. then, huh?
Yeah.
No. At least in the West, the Americas.
Oh yeah, I would say so. The most similar we are, but I would say that we were at least officially before the U.S. Because if you think about the U.S., you had the civil rights in 1965, right? Until then, you still have a lot of segregation, which in Brazil we didn't have anymore. Although the segregation was basically in terms of the incomes that you had and the opportunities of studying abroad and studying inside. So, which still is a problem in here. But I would say that Brazil has evolved a lot in the past years, promoting more opportunities, especially for the people that would be more of the African origins descendants, right? So I don't know if I answered quite well your question, but
I had a question because you mentioned like settling. There's a lot of settling of the cultures and how much money you would make in class and sort of stuff. Where did a lot of the slaves kind of settle? Like, were they putting them more in northern Brazil? Was it more Rio? Was it kind of spread out? Like, what was kind of the main settling areas for the slaves and when slavery was abolished?
Well, the capitanias, remember, that then became states. Basically were the ones receiving the slaves. So, and they would come to Rio and the whole northeastern coast. At some point, they also went to Minas Gerais when we started to have the boom of gold and silver coming from Minas Gerais. And once slavery was abolished, basically they remained in those same areas. They didn't move around. So that's a difference that you see if you go to the south, down from São Paulo to the south. You would see that the profile, our people profile, are much more European because we didn't have much slavery going on to the Rio Grande do Sul or Paraná, Santa Catarina. Those were the states that actually started to evolve more with the industrial base. And then that's why they received more of the immigrants coming in at the end of the 19th to the beginning of the 20th century. So if you look at Brazil, you've been into Bahia last year. Bahia is probably the state that has the majority of, I would say, the African descendant populations. But the whole Northeast and Rio also. Rio is kind of half and half of the population, more Portuguese and Arabs. Of course, Arabs, we have to remember, we're not only the Japanese descendants, but we have the highest Lebanese and Syrians descendants living in Brazil. That's a number of close to 5 million. So it's twice the average of the Japanese descendants. And And these guys also came basically to Sao Paulo or to Rio also in different phases, which is interesting.
Take us through a little bit. I'm going to switch gears. Again, the history of democracy. Once the revolution in the U.S. was over, they wrote the Constitution, and it's been fairly steady democracy. Brazil's had some ups and downs, and it started, it had its own constitution. The emperor was there for a while. So please just take us through, quickly, because
Yep.
one of the dark periods was in our lifetime with the military rulers.
Yeah,
So,
absolutely.
I mean, that was a tough period. So,
Yeah.
I don't kind of just take us through the years in a quick summary, so we get an understanding, because that's affected how the country
Yeah.
has evolved,
Yeah.
obviously.
Yep. Think about it. 322 years, a colony, Portuguese colony. 50 to 60, almost 60 years as an empire, right? And we finally became a republic in 1889. And we became a republic basically with the military. At some point, the military, especially in Rio, Sao Paulo, they're starting to kind of like what happened in Europe with the Enlightenment kind of stuff. And they started to react also against having a monarchy here. So then we started to have elections. And we did, as the US, been having elections for a long period of time. And in between, so we're talking about 1889 until now, it's 130 something years. We had a period of time when basically the Paulistas and the Cariocas and the Mineiros, the kind of the leaders of these three important states, most of them from the military, but not only, they were changing the positions every 4 years as the president. Until at one point, we had the first, let's say, coup with Getúlio Vargas, the famous, our Perón, the Brazilian Perón is Getúlio Vargas, the one that has the same problems if you think about everything that happened. So Getúlio, at some point, he didn't declare a dictatorship, but we were actually a dictatorship.
And
at one point,
this was after World War II, right?
No, before the World War II.
Okay, got it.
So Brazil joined the Allies in '44, which was the good thing, because at the start of the war, the Brazilian government was, I would say, more friendly to the Germans, right? And especially to the Italian Mussolini. But because the U.S. had such an important role also in Brazil, especially with the bases that they needed in the Northeast, Brazil actually woke up and joined the efforts. So then, but again, we still had elections going on, with the exception of these 15 years with Getúlio Vargas. But after he left, we continued with the elections. And in '64, then we had a military coup. And we had a dictatorship here for 21 years. Brazil was before a dictatorship in Latin America before Chile and Argentina and Uruguay. So a lot of people would say that whatever starts and happens in Brazil slowly goes to the other Latin American countries, the bad and the good. So, and after that, only in '85, so that's exactly 40 years this year, that we actually came back to democracy, and we're having the natural terms of the 4-year mandates for the presidents. They can be reelected, and different than the US, they can't have a 3-time election, but if they interrupt, they can, as Lula. So Lula was twice the president, and he got elected for the 3rd time, but he couldn't have a term be in the same cycle. So,
so like if Obama ran this year,
yes, exactly, yeah. I wished we would have the same rules as you have in the U.S., but we don't.
All right, Nick, we might as well shift into politics since he mentioned Lula. So he was your 35th and 39th president. I looked it up.
Oh, yeah? So you're better than I am.
Yeah, 35th from 2003 to 2011, and then starting again January 2023. He's currently.
Yeah.
The first time I came to Brazil, which shockingly was 1987, he was running as the trade union leader as part of this kind of coming out from this military dictatorship. The country was still teetering a little,
Yeah.
and he had very little support and wasn't able to win. But that was in the 80s. And
Yep.
and he stayed in, obviously the spotlight, was able to take power in '03, just like I mentioned. He was a strong socialist back then.
Hmm.
So tell us about your current president and your previous president, Lula, and tell us your feeling about him over the years since you've grown up of
Hmm.
sorts with him in
Yeah.
national spotlight, right?
Yeah. So to your point, Lula ran in all the elections, with the exception as the one that Dilma won because he was the one that supported her, and because he couldn't have a third term, a sequential term, and the other term where when he was actually in jail, so he couldn't run. A part of that, he ran four times, lost, three times lost, and then became the president in 2003, as you said. Uh, so, what I would say is that how can I summarize this?
Well, you weren't a fan in 2003 when he got in.
No,
As a
I,
businessman, right?
I was never a fan. I continue not being a fan, and I see that unfortunately, as he is a populist, uh, he will continue being a stubborn populist, insisting on policies that at some point can leverage the country and give you good indicators. Like last year, we grew a lot, 3.6 of the GDP. Nobody was expecting, but we're growing this basically because there's a lot of public investments and a lot of public financing and a lot of public subsidies. So we're still trapped in this kind of circle and not able to set the base for true growth, the economy, right? So at the first two terms, Lula was very fortunate because it coincided with the commodities boom and with China joining the Commerce Organization, right? Had just joined in 2001. So from 2003 to 2008, basically Brazil was able to export not only that time since then, but then we grew a lot of reserves and we had a very strong economy growing, booming. Lula was able to introduce, and this is to his benefit, a lot of interesting policies to the more poor people, not only in education, but in subsidies to help the families improve a little bit of their earnings. But again, as we say here, this is kind of the chicken flights, instead of the country really setting the basis for growth in terms of what it is capable of, the government continues insisting. So the debt is now risen a lot. Interest rates went back, skyrocketed again because we're facing a new, as usual, right, moment of the whole entire world looking at us and saying, how long can we stay with this, right? So I would say that to his benefit, Brazil was able the last 20 something years to settle a lot of policies that helped improve the quality of life of many people, especially the more poor. If you go to the Northeast, if you go to other places, we had a lot of new wealth coming in, just not enough, right? And we have continued with, which I would say, the worst nightmare, and this continued with the former president Bolsonaro. So it's not only a PT policy. I say it's the policy that very few of the people earn keep the most of the taxes and the GDP. So I've mentioned to you this before, and this is very sad. Three indices, right? We have 35% more or less of taxes in Brazil compared to yours, probably at 48, 45s in Europe. But if we compare ourselves with Chile, with Mexico, with Peru, with Argentina, which would be similar to our country, these guys are under 25, 26, 24, and we're 35. So we're a much higher level. And 80% of all this collection of taxes in Brazil is to pay salaries and pensions. We are the number one country paying pensions. And this is true, more or less 80% of 35. So this is 28% of the GDP. 14 is to pay pensions, 14 to pay public employees. And this includes the military, includes all the politicians, all the judiciary. So Brazil has the most expensive judiciary system. It's 1.5% of GDP. We spend as much with the tribunals and the justice systems and all those fancy guys wearing those fancy suits, 1.5 of the GDP. And we spend another 1.5 to pay the policemen, to pay the jail keepers, to run, so it's terrible, this. And just another number, of the 14% of GDP that is dedicated to pay pensions, right? I was looking at these numbers. They probably are not actually updated, but we have like 35 million people in Brazil. We were 210 million people. So 45 million of us are already retired. So of these 35, you have basically 95% of private companies, such as I am. I'm not retired yet, but I was working for the private sector. I will be retired sometime. So I will receive my Social Security, right? The other 4% of all the retirees are basically the public employees in the military. And they gather, of the whole GDP of this country, they gather almost 3.5%. And they're very slim. This is 1 million people. So less than 0.5% of the population keeps 3% something of the GDP.
So I think, as I've seen through Brazil, there's been a president's problem. You mentioned Lula going to jail. That's been in the news with America, with Trump for a bit. Can you explain why he went to jail? And then after, didn't the next president after him also get impeached?
Yes.
Yeah. So what's the story with that? Because that's back to back, and then you have Bolsonaro, then you're back to Lula. All sort of mess.
So in our 40 years democracy, right? It's in 1885. The first president that was elected, Collor, was impeached. 2.5 years in government, he was impeached. And he actually didn't go to jail yet, as much as I don't believe he will, because now he's an older person. But he got sued and he was convicted, right, in some crimes. Lula went to jail. He stayed there for almost 1.5 years and was actually released later because there were some scandals by the way that the justice system reacted, and that ultimately put Lula, not only Lula, a lot of other guys, politicians and other, into jail. But the way the justice, the specifics of justice. So if you're rich, justice doesn't matter. Look at the U.S., right? It's just a matter of, filling up a form and say, hey, I'm sorry, you missed a comma here, right? But to your point, Lula was, nobody said he's innocent, but he was kind of said, you had to be judged again, because the way they judged you and put you in jail was done in a way that didn't apply to the Constitution. So, but he was accused of many crimes of him, some families, and especially all the politicians and some entrepreneurs that helping and benefiting of the growth of the country, that he got lots of bribes, and under his government, a lot of things were badly conducted, especially in Petrobras, the big petrol company, but not only, right? And now we're facing another situation, which the last president, Bolsonaro, is actually probably going to be convicted, and he may go probably to jail, as we don't expect, but he is probably going to jail too, because different crimes, also with some bribery in the middle of this, but then because he was trying to promote coup before handling the government to Lula. So now
But
this is all over the news.
After Lula, Dilma, his vice president, who went on to lead the Workers' Party,
Yeah,
she also was impeached.
Yeah, she was impeached not for reasons of corruption. She was impeached basically because there was kind of an alignment in Congress that decided she was doing so many bad things. So they were able to set the mode of saying that she was failing in some of the legislation. So she wasn't complying to the Constitution in some aspects. So they were able to join and create this movement that actually impeached her. And at that time, I was in favor because all the country was really, really in a mess. And today, I say I regret it, because ideally she should have ended her cycle, and then she would never be elected again, because we would still continue in a big mess. I don't know for how long, but probably the PT as the government, as the ruler, as the party, would really be kind of kicked out. Nobody knows for sure, but because of her impeachment lately, we had her vice president, Temer, who was not impeached, but he went to jail for some days after he left government, also because of corruption, which wasn't fair, to tell you the truth. It wasn't fair to him, but it was the political vibe. And then Bolsonaro was reelected in a landslide, basically because everybody didn't want the PT anymore. And he wasn't really able to do the things that he was elected for. And that's why PT came back to government. Kind of Biden and Trump, I think his biggest failure is that he allowed Lula to come back. And I hope Lula won't fail again to allow him, to run again. But this is what may happen.
I mean, it's volatile there as it is here, and as we all know, in so many different countries. And I mean, the corruption side of Brazil is always a challenge. And you've mentioned security. You had mentioned that at some point, I think you said 2% of the whole GDP is for security in Brazil. So
the number, yeah. If you think about two numbers, right? The whole problem of security or an insecurity, right? We have more or less 5% of GDP, be it to pay for all the security forces, right? You go to the malls here, you've been to go to hospitals, you go to every single building, and not only public and private buildings, the cars with the, how do we say, the armored cars, right?
Yeah, and the bulletproof glass on the cars.
The bulletproof cars, and all this industry is a huge bunch. But also all the industry related to the insurance of robber theft, of moving in trucks to places which are more in the crime zone, the militias, and so in total, if the security issue here consumes 5% of GDP, more or less 2.5 or 3 are basically what we pay extra to try to keep ourselves safer. I was working for malls, as you know, for many years, and before that, retail, and that was the single largest. Before, not considering the salaries, right, for the employees, but that was the single. It is the single point of expense in all the P&Ls for these companies. So paying for the security guards and all the security systems. I would say, just to make a point here, we've been able, especially because of all the scandals with Petrolão, the Petróleo, most of the companies, especially the foreign companies, the international companies, as my example, we went through this the last 10 years, basically, setting a lot of compliances rules. And it's much, much better now, the environment in terms of the public, the politicians' relations, although we still have a lot of the corruption going on. But at the same time, as we haven't been able to progress in terms of creating a stable country, we still have a lot of crime. It's the number one issue that worries everybody here. It's crime.
Cycling back to my first question, which was, what do Americans and a lot of people outside of Brazil see Brazil as? I think crime is something that probably comes to mind similarly with Colombia and with Venezuela and with a lot of Central American countries. Do you think? Because I remember I had a friend going to Brazil, and they talked about he was like, they just kept telling him about how it was going to be dangerous and be careful and I was like, I've been there. I haven't had an issue with it, but how accurate or close to accurate or whatever do you think the kind of claims are of how outside of Brazilians or even Brazilians back at home say about the crime? Is it as crazy and as bad as a lot of people claim it to be and similar to its neighbors? Or is it not as...
Nick, you've been here, and Leonard has been here many more times than you. And so, as you mentioned, we can go to lots of places and not feel unsafe, right? But at the same time, you wouldn't go to many other places. So it depends, number one, where you go. It depends, number two, at what time and exactly what you're carrying on with you. So, of course, we'd never recommend, as I said, you don't carry your cell phone just like that. Because you would be robbed. I was robbed in New York City. Leonard was there, so somebody stole my cell phone, but they didn't come with a knife or with a gun, right? And I didn't see that happen. I was just probably stupid, and somebody just picked it up. And but in all Europe, you see all those stories of people pickpockets. But again, I would say it's a dangerous place as a whole. Basically, when you come, you go to protected areas. You stay in safer places. So, and I would never recommend, especially the foreigners, to walk around alone at night. So, but this is not only in Brazil. But this is we have to be honest about that.
Do you think Brazil, out of all the other South American countries, do you think it's crime is the worst in Brazil, or is it more Colombia? Is it more Venezuela? Or is it...
Colombia has improved a lot, much as I heard. I would say Venezuela probably is much worse now for the last years. I know that Ecuador and all the Guatemalas and all the South, the Central American countries are going to hell, right? And if you look at the numbers of people killed in robberies and just in the streets, they have higher numbers than in Brazil. But being such a big country, so diverse, as I mentioned, and with so many people, so rich, you feel that the difference here more probably than you feel going to Guatemala or definitely to Venezuela, So, and this is what I think it makes our case worse, because we shouldn't, we could do much better, and we have to do much better. But this is reality.
I also think, to shift gears a little bit, I think something that's so popular and so beloved, which is the Amazon. I've heard there's been some issues with the Amazon and there's been problems. So what's kind of going on with the Amazon? Is it, what's up? Mm-hmm. What's the news about the Amazon?
But basically, Brazil, just in general, would have three kind of different ecosystems, right? So Amazon as a whole is 60% of the territory. You would have what we call the Atlantic forest, basically all through the coast, and then the Cerrado, which is also a huge portion, 30% more or less, basically where you have the agro business being developed. Of the original Atlantic forests, we only have like 12-13% of it. Of course, since Brazil was discovered, from the Cerrado, we're also, and especially since the 1980s and especially the year 2000s on, especially because the commodities, the agro industry has grown a lot. And you cannot plant soya or other stuff if you don't just eliminate the forests. So of the total Amazon, let's say the 60%, the numbers, I don't know if they're totally accurate, but we estimate that we hold 80% of the original forest, which is a problem, because what people say is that it comes to a point, especially as you evolve from the Cerrado, the borders of the Amazonas is the Cerrado. So as the agro business continues to grow, they start cutting all the forests, right? Those border states. And it comes to a point that you probably won't be able to sustain the whole, the balance. So this is to be seen. I would say that we have improved a little bit the deforestation cycle, but as much as we continue to deforest, it's a problem. And here is a tricky point, because Brazil likes to boast that, and it's real, it's true, it's not a lie, that we have probably one of the most conservative systems of protecting the forests, right? But at the same time, the thing is, it may not be enough. So when you have some land in the Amazon, you, by law, have to keep at least 80% of it, but you can still destroy 20, right? In the Cerrado, which is the biggest problem now, more than the Amazon, is where the Pantanal is where all you saw those huge droughts and the fires. The Cerrado, you could by law originally use like 50 or 60% of the land. So that's why it grew so much. All those states, Maranhão and Goiás and Mato Grosso, right? So I would say that this has become a much stronger discussion here. This is the good side of things. I think people are realizing that we have to start. We don't need to deforest anything else. We just have to, by contrary, be able to reintroduce the forests in so many wasteland, right? So this is the good thing also, because we have so much wasteland that were the original forest, the Atlantic coast. If you travel from Rio to Sao Paulo by car, you would see that's a lot of wasteland. I mean, you could have efforts, and there are companies, a lot of investments saying that they will be able to come to Brazil to reforest, right? I don't know if the term is that, reforest. So it's a big issue. It became something that the country is realizing the importance. And to be fair, the people really involved in the agro business, a very slim minority are the ones that still doing a lot of bad stuff. The ones that are integrated with the chains of commerce and all the commodity cycles, they're much more aware that they cannot destroy anymore. But they did destroy for the past 30 years. Just keep this number. The state of Sao Paulo, once it introduced the alcohol in the cars, right? We are very proud of saying that we have a very kind of clean energy running in the cars. So it's sugarcane. If you look at the state of Sao Paulo, since the 1970s to the 1980s, I would say 60% 70% of the state of Sao Paulo became sugarcane or oranges or, all kinds of fruit. So this is the reality. I mean, the whole world did that. The states did that too. So it's not just Brazil.
Well, thank you, Filipe. You've been very insightful as always. Nick, we've learned a lot again.
Yeah.